Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Flanders, and thank you for joining us in this week's live talkback, our first live post-show premiere talkback of the 2021 fall season. We kicked off with a bang, I have to say, in the sense that we are talking about one of the most important topics of this moment. I don't know why I am please mute your YouTube. Audio playing, please mute it. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you. I am happy to welcome Scott Nakagawa joining us on the live talkback, and thank you for joining us in this first live post-show talkback of the fall season. We kicked off, I don't want to say with a bang, but with the biggest topic that I can think of, and at the most extraordinarily tough moment, I think, to be talking about democracy right after this country and this world went through the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the US, is a tough coincidence of events. Because I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of the last week really looking backwards at just how the trajectories of so many lives were interrupted in that one day, a day that we couldn't have anticipated, although some people perhaps could. Condi, where are you? We were looking back for the last week, but this show is all about looking forward. This conversation that we had today is about how do we use this moment to pursue, as I think you put it, Rachel, and Adrian put it, the dream of democracy, which has never been real in this country, which is still ahead of us, and which takes knock after knock after knock, but keeps on going. And as you reminded us, Rachel, so beautifully at the end of the show, did celebrate some achievements with the election of last fall. And that Saturday after the election reflected a bigger electorate than ever, a more diverse electorate than ever, a younger electorate, an electorate that was more related to social movements and advancing a more radical vision than we'd seen in years. So I do want to kind of start there. A year ago, Scott, you and I talked about, the state of our democracy after January 6th, and we had one of these kind of check-in programs. It does seem to me that the work that we profiled in today's show spoke to what we talked about Inauguration Week, which was about that broadening of our democracy being coupled with a deepening of what we understand to be the process. So let's just start with you, Scott. It feels impossible not to talk about 9/11 for a second, but how have you been combining the many elements of this week into a moment in which we sit right now?
It's quite a stew. The 9/11, of course, the 9/11 anniversary does remind me of just how powerfully 9/11 changed the context for the fight for democracy, not just in the United States, but globally. It really raised the stakes and made it very clear to us that we were going to be in a very different time when authoritarian solutions might appear to be much more appealing to people. When people are scared, when they're frightened like that, they often turn in that direction. We saw that happen after 9/11 when people went for the Patriot Act immediately. And so many laws were passed and that basically violated our civil liberties and the civil rights of many people in the United States. Those laws still exist. They don't always exist in the place they used to. Sometimes they're housed at the Pentagon or in other places, but the amount of spying that's possible now as a result of 9/11 is something we should keep in mind. So January 6th, another one of those frightening events. We have to be very careful about how we react to these things and recognize that we can't trade our freedoms for some false sense of security.
Rachel, to you on this question of unity, that was the other subject that I heard, the narrative that I heard repeated and repeated this week. And we were reminded, of course, we weren't so unified. And Kamala Harris and some of the others mentioned the assaults on Sikh and Muslim Americans in the immediate wake of the attacks. How have you been thinking about this week and finding a place in it for yourself and your work?
I've been holding a lot this week, as you mentioned. Before we went on air, my father passed away this week, and I've been thinking a lot about how we experience loss. and how we grieve in this country. And I think that 9/11 began a very specific period in our country of loss that I think that it in a grieving process that's been very largely unmanaged and unsurfaced and not led. And I think that that grief has lashed out as you see that what might happen in family dynamics. You see, tensions flaring around a funeral. And I think that we've seen that, kind of played out on a larger stage. So I've been thinking a lot about that recently. And generally speaking, that's where I've been, kind of had a lot of gravity pulling me, is that I think that one of the ways in which our organizing strategies have fallen short, over the years, is that they've kind of lent themselves to less humanity and not more. And the ways in which we need to lean in and understand that when Scott and I had this conversation, that when the reality becomes too painful, people will create a sub reality. When we can't deal with the issue at hand that feels too big or too large, we'll create a smaller little subset of anger or fear or drama that feels manageable, to us. And I think as a country, we cannot continue to manage our feelings around a lack of safety or a loss of a specific era or anything like that on an individual level anymore, which I think is, has largely been a lot of our response. And I think we have to think about what our overall response is and how we begin to responding to challenges, especially as we go into an era where we know we're going to be faced with myriad crises that we don't have an answer for, as climate continues to move forward and all of these things that we know are on the horizon. How do we deal with it when we're presented with something that we don't know how to solve, or a crisis that we don't know how to solve? So I know that that's a little kind of not as concrete as, well, we need a policy to do X, Y, or Z thing. But I actually think that people don't make a lot of their decisions about their lives or even their government officials with their heads. I think it's something that we make with our hearts and with our guts. And I think that we have to think about, almost trauma-informed policy moving forward as a country, as we think about what healing looks like, so that we can have reasonable, responses to things that happen that challenge us in a way that, doesn't encroach upon, civil rights and civil liberties.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And yes, our hearts have been with you specifically this week, and deeply appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you.
Interesting, this conversation and what you just said really relates to the show we had on last week, where we were talking with filmmakers who had their own personal family experience with incarceration, and that had driven them to create a project where they used their filmmaking skills to present judges a more complete picture of the person they are about to sentence. So this is a group called The Complete Picture that creates sentencing videos that the judges and the probation officers look at before they send a nonviolent defendant to prison. And so many of those videos were about untreated trauma, socioeconomic conditions, things that defendants are not able to talk about in their court cases. And watching the videos, as we talked to some of the people whose videos had been made, they said, whatever happens in the courtroom, these videos gave me a picture of myself I had never heard or seen, even from my own family members. So there's the trauma that we go through. There's the failure to even be seen by the people we love or communicate to the people whom we love how much we see them. And there, as you point out, the stories that we then tell to fill that gap. And they can be authoritarian stories, they can be cultish stories, they can be religious stories, identity stories, scary or helpful. I wonder, and Scott, you know a little bit more about the United Vision for Idaho project than I do, and Adrienne would have loved to have been here, but she's on an airplane right now. I'm guessing that those text messaged conversations, 42,000 of which have taken place, that people were willing to participate in, start with addressing some stew, if you will, of those things: trauma, personal, narrative, healing, seeing, acknowledging, recognizing. Can you tell us what you know?
Well, what I know is that, there are over 42,000 conversations that have happened with people who we think of as the other, right? Those of us who are progressive in our politics think of as the other, conservative voters, mostly white, largely rural. And I think what we're starting to learn is that, there are these sort of hidden stories that people live that don't fit inside of the easy containers we try to put people in, like, Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. People just don't fit in those kinds of boxes, that their lives are far more complex than we imagine, and that decision-making points are, occur at many different places in our lives. So I think that's one thing. The other thing just, is building on what Rachel said in this conversation we had with each other a while ago about how people let go of reality when it's too painful to live it. The Republican base in the United States right now is a radical base, right? Because the Republican Party is a radical party. The Democratic Party is not what I think of as a radical party, but the Republican Party is certainly a radical right-wing party right now, one of the most right-wing parties in the world. And so the base has been, treated to, dosed with this sort of radicalizing formula of demonization and hate and anxiety and fear, and have been invited into a sense of unreality. And that unreality is populated with feminists who are trying to steal men's masculinity, and Muslims who are creeping into the United States and will destroy Christianity in the world and here at home, and immigrants who are not just stealing our jobs, but apparently rapists and murderers and drug dealers, and it's grown over time into this remarkable kind of conspiracy theory. I think of a theory as a systemic way of explaining reality, whereas conspiracy theories are systemic ways of explaining unreality, right? And that's the playground of the fascists, is that world of unreality, where simple solutions suffice for our more complex understanding of people, just like what you described in the courtroom, right? It's easy enough to sentence somebody until you see their story and recognize how complex they are, that they're not the demon you imagine.
It's interesting.
I would add one thing to that, if I may, that I think that there's a challenge here also of a group of people seeing that story actually about themselves and being very challenged by the emotions that it brings up, because it's not aligned with who they think they are, how they think they got there, and what their values are. So I think that there's that happening actually on both sides. That's the only thing that I would add there. And I think that that's actually a big piece.
It goes back to that critical race theory conversation too. It's like we don't actually want to address our actual history because we don't want to see ourselves in that story. We have a participant in the United Vision Project with us in the chat, and her name is Marie Jopich, and she starts, I think, importantly by saying that the text message that they send asks a question. It doesn't state something. It asks a question. Why do you think we are divided? And then when I asked her to tell a little bit more about what happens in the conversation, she says, many are very afraid. They think their rights are at risk, just as you said, Scott. They no longer trust the media, even Fox News. So that pushes them into alternate news. And I think that's not unrelated actually to the 9/11 truther movement that we saw after 9/11. The government does lie to us. I think all of us in this chat would understand that that has always happened in advance of every war. It happens all the time. And the shock of that was nothing new when we saw the lead up to the war, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan. But for many people, it was kind of a shock if they had told themselves the story that the Bush administration was their administration and those people were their people. At that moment, I feel a failure as a member of the media, a failure to figure out how do we raise the why question. Because there's the fact of the lying, and then there's the question, well, why? Why? And it's in the answer to that why that we can actually move forward. Governments lie into war because they want to protect assets overseas, gain access to new markets, control revenues from oil sources in huge oil-rich countries like Iraq, for example. You name it, we can answer some of those whys, or at least have a question about them. But if we never raise the question or engage in that question nationally, instead everyone goes off into their own atomized, this is why reason. They're doing it for the feminazis. They're doing it for the who the hell knows. I feel desperate that we cannot do enough work in a once a week television program, and we never do it perfectly, to re-knit this conversation that we need to have. So I'm going to throw it to you, Scott. Like, how do we do something differently in the media going forward to address this?
That's rough because there's a why with the media too, right? And then why a lot of it has to do with money. And, so I work with people, for example, who are in Southwest Washington, who are organizing in smaller communities and suburbs there. And what they tell me is that the folks in the communities that they're working with largely use Facebook for their news, if you can believe that, right? And it's because local media in those markets has just been gutted. And so the local paper no longer runs, it's just, the way that people are now connected to one another is on things like Facebook. It makes me think of the Philippines, where Facebook is basically people's on-ramp to the internet. And so everyone has it. And of course, it creates this sort of virtual environment in which anything can be true and nothing at the same time. And so, I do think that it's very, very important for us to remember that freedom of the press is one of the attributes of a democratic state that the right is attacking, and attacking very purposefully by seeding mistrust. I think that in order for us to be able to really, use the media effectively to counter that attack, is to tell the stories of real people as they're living them, right? So much of what I see on cable news is just a bunch of sensationalism, whether it's coming from the left or the right. Very little of it focuses on the stories of real people, what real people are experiencing, what they're actually suffering. Are they really being affected by the issues that we're talking about in the media? Or is it something else? If you live in Janesville, Ohio, is it really the biggest thing that's happening to you right now? What's happening, that there's, like a fire in California? Why are those stories never told? I think that absence causes a failure of relationship. A sense that what's there is basically a story about somebody else. And as long as it is, why trust it?
Yeah. It keeps taking me back to kind of consciousness raising, Rachel. It's such a retro term, but those were revolutionary conversations that people had with one another at the birth of, I guess it was the second wave of the women's movement. I lose track.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that we could do. And first is that I think the media could take a stance on policy reform at Facebook and other, online platforms, as Facebook has been extremely deft at avoiding any real consequence for the misinformation and disinformation that it has, been a part of peddling. So I think that there are some really concrete actions that we could take, and that there would be consequences if more of those stories got told, because I don't think that people realize exactly what a hotbed all of the platforms are, all of them, including the one we're streaming on right now. In fact, there's a large white supremacist and white nationalist recruiting apparatus on YouTube, and so I think that there are those pieces. And so what we have tried to do is, thinking about those kitchen table conversations, we have a couple of programs that, are kind of contribution to this. And one of them is called Digital Defenders. And it does aim to correct misinformation and disinformation through those actual networks that Scott talked about, because many people are getting their news from their friends or in groups, either locked or unlocked on Facebook or chats. Increasingly now there's rooms that Twitter just rolled out. So people do get their information in very horizontal ways, particularly in places that don't have large mass market media. And so I think that there's that we can do, in addition to the platform piece. But I also think that, there's offline organizing as well. And there are ways to strengthen community bonds that don't have to do with, kind of the way that we consume media. And so I think that it's like a 1-2 punch, that we have to understand that. I think a lot of times we think like, because of the information age that we live in, because of online, that, the problem lives there, but the problem actually lives in other places. I was in, when the COVID first hit, I stayed at my uncle's in a small town right outside of Milwaukee, and which is where I'm from. And there was it was like people were there was something to do with light poles, light fixtures, and people didn't like it. And everyone was going to write a letter. And I said, are you all coordinating the letter writing? And they were like, no, I'm going to write a letter. And then I know that guy's going to write a letter. And it's like, why are you talking to each other about this? Like, did you get on the group text and figure it out? And they said, no, there's no group text. We don't know that guy. Like, we just, you know what I mean? And when I think about it, I'm like, if you went to a normal small town anywhere in you talked about Janesville, Ohio, and Janesville, Wisconsin, wherever, do people know how to put on like go to a town hall meeting? Do we know how to lobby? You know what I mean? And so I think that there's some like interpersonal infrastructure that needs to be built so that a healthy media could inform, you know, those groups of people to have an ecosystem of this is the way that we want to live, and this is the information that we get that helps us make the choices about the way that we move together. And so I think that there's a 1-2 punch there.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see. We have on our agenda to look on the show at the media infrastructure that got built during COVID, because it's our suspicion that there have actually been some real leaps forward when it comes to creating community connection, even just about mutual aid networks and how to inform one another. And we're actually collaborating with Epicenter NYC, Mitra Kalita's organization, every month in a media roundtable, where she talks, among other things, about what that newsletter, the online that was just to serve Queens, New York, originally the epicenter of the pandemic, has grown into, because people were so hungry for information that was actually useful. We have a lot of questions on the chat that go in a variety of directions. One of them arose during the show, and I just want to touch on it before we close. And that was, I said, you know, it's ridiculous. I didn't say ridiculous. I said, you know, it's extraordinary that United Vision for Idaho has to do this investigative work about why people vote the way they do. Why doesn't the Democratic Party do that invest in that kind of research? And Marie, who participates with United Vision, said, the whole point is we're not partisan. We wouldn't want saying that we're Democrats to mess up the conversations. And then we've had a conversation about the pros and cons of party affiliation and what would you call yourself if you didn't call yourself a Democrat. And then the second part of the second conversation, a question that's arose, is the relationship to capitalism. And that may be beyond what we can actually handle in the rest of this talkback. But I do think that capitalism as an economic system sets up a power division between those who have resource and capital and ability to exploit others, and those who do labor and find themselves exploited. So I think it's all part of the mix. But why don't we start with the party piece? Because that seems doable. I am frustrated that our parties, I mean, I think the Republican Party does quite a lot of research. I'm assuming the Democrats do more than I'm aware of, but I assume that every year I look, and as I wrote in the book Blue Grit, I discovered to my horror that in fact that's not happening. There isn't even anything really that constitutes a party in any other country. Scott, to you. Party, good, bad, helpful? What's an alternative?
Well, we certainly want a multi-party system. You know, a single party system would be totalitarianism, and so we don't want that. But, you know, I do have some cynicism about the Democratic Party's ability to actually fight this fight effectively. On the, you know, in terms of research, I mean, they usually use, as most people do, for-profit, data communications kind of research shops in order to figure out how to frame messages and campaigns. And, you know, for those places, the data they have from the past is like capital, right? Because it gives you the ability to do longitudinal analysis. And what has the party been concerned about in the past is white middle class voters, right? And so at a time when so much is changing, they're going to have to catch up. And so I think that's important. I just want to say this though, because you brought up capitalism, and it's just one of my favorite subjects.
I was like, that's going to be Scott. Listen, I have things to say about the ground stuff, but I know.
But on this capitalism question, though, I think it is really, really important for us to keep in mind how much of what we're facing now is driven by the kind of economic circumstances that we're in, right? And its failure to address the needs of most people in a rapidly changing world. And so whether you're, you know, someone who believes in capitalism or you believe in something else, you know, I think that it's important to be critical of the system that we're in and understand its failures. And, you know, one of the key things to keep in mind, I think, is those failures are what we're really all fighting about ultimately. And what the right is basically proposing is a system that leads away from capitalism towards something more like aristocracy, right? And more toward oligarchy. And so that's the kind of cultural stew that we're in, and we should keep that in mind in the fight. There is an economic consequence to what they're proposing, and it's not good. We could have something worse than capitalism, in fact, and that's the direction they want to take us in. That's what minority rule is all about.
There was always a power imbalance, I'm reminded, before, of course, capitalism, and that was patriarchy and racial structures of different kinds. Patriarchy, do you want to chew that, Rachel?
Oh, all day, every day. What I would
Patriarchy.
say to Scott's point, though, is that there actually is a tie between what's happening right now in capitalism in terms of like a structural sense, because innovation generally tends to come, as much as we think it like happens in a think tank somewhere far away. Where innovation actually tends to happen is from the ground up, and really effective, kind of structures, whether they're corporate structures or organizing structures. The role of the organizations or the apparatus, whatever that looks like, to on top, is not to innovate, but rather to scale the innovation that comes from the ground. And so, in some ways, I think that it's not at all surprising that what's happening is happening at United Visions of Idaho or in other places that is very close to the ground, because they're best able to, really be refining and sharpening these, the approaches. But what then needs to happen is, okay, now that we've had the report, how do we get it big? And so that's why the collaboration is absolutely necessary. So I'm not at all surprised by that. Like when I was in graduate school, you used to read case studies about the ways in which Bruegger's bagels would, innovate in individual franchises and that they would scale it, right? So it's not unique at all to organizing. But what the problem is with the party is that why, there's the infrastructure, the investment, to Scott's point, the lag, the heaviness, And so I think that the fact that the innovation is coming from the ground right now is not surprising to me. And I think, to get to the point about patriarchy, the fact that it's coming and being driven by women is not surprising to me, because of the role that women play inside of families and inside of communities, and the roles that women play in terms of patriarchy. Many of us at Women's March and at many other organizations, when Trump came into power, with his, I don't know if I can say this on air, but with his grab them by the, comments and things like that. And it became very clear that what he was the thing about Trump is that he loved to not just do the thing that he was going to do, but then he loved to tell you that he was doing the thing that he was going to do. And so we were saying, look, he's saying his rise to power is fueled by a very specific ideology that has actually not just like old or reworn, but ancient tropes associated with it in terms of xenophobia and patriarchy, that in many ways are older than capitalism, and although they're using that to fuel capitalism in terms of what they're trying to achieve, it's a tale as old as time. And so thinking about how we, continue to innovate and listen to folks on the ground, is we have to continue to evolve our approach and our, kind of vision, and to maintain, I think, in the face of such a difficult onslaught, our ability to hope and our ability to imagine a different future, because you hit what you aim for. And if we don't have something to aim for, if we don't have a vision of what the future could be for us, then there's actually, it's just kind of like, shooting darts in the dark. So I think that for patriarchy, the thing to understand that I think that for patriarchy and also for white supremacists, their big fear is always that women or people of color are going to get into power and treat that power in the same way that white men have treated that power, right? And to establish and continue systems of domination. And I think that that's part of what we have to reject. And so I think it goes back to my first point of, in order to battle patriarchy, we have to understand that we're not, the solution bringers. We're the contribution bringers. We have to put our grain of sand onto the scales, and we have to move forward together, collectively. It's going to take all of our varied contributions, all of our disparate skills, all of our different passions, and we're going to have to put those all in a pot and wait for that mass to outweigh things. And the way that we do that necessarily has to be collective. It has to be with building people's power, because those are the things you can't you know, the saying is you have to fight fire with fire. You actually fight fire with water, right? And so like we necessarily can't do the thing that they're afraid of because we couldn't win if we did. And so I think that, you know, patriarchy and all of its fears, it's so fragile, it's so afraid of everything, you know, is really afraid of the power of all of us and what happens when all of us get together, and making sure that our feminism is inclusive and includes folks that have been left behind before, which I think drove a lot of the failures of our movement and our inability to achieve that power. So making sure that people with disabilities, trans folks, people of color, you know, people of different socioeconomic status are involved in this process of becoming the biggest and most powerful us possible is the way that we win. And it's the way that I keep my boot on patriarchy's neck every single day.
Rachel, thank you so much for that. You hit what you aim for. We're clear what we're aiming for in these conversations. We will continue to have them. Scott, if you have a closing word or two, please share it. But please share the word about this program. Our goal is, and we're moving towards it, is to have a homestead in public television, which is at the moment one of the few non-commercial outlets reaching places that are red, that are blue, that are urban, that are rural. It has its flaws. It needs more programming like this, but it's there, and we'll never get anything like public television again, at least in my lifetime, I don't think, from our Congress. We're on every week on over, just about 300 television and radio stations across the country. If you haven't subscribed, people, please do spread the word. Next week, we'll be back with a program about soft versus hard approaches to climate change. And you'll find out more about that directly from the source in the New Orleans area in Louisiana, and from landscape architect Kate Orff. We've got a whole lot more coming up on the show and in this ongoing series. Scott, will you join me in another discussion sometime soon?
Yes, always. Always. What is it?
And a closing thought from you?
Well, I just want to reinforce what Rachel said, about having to build the most expansive we possible. I think Wendy Brown, who's an academic, said that democracy requires a constituent we, right? I think that we know why democracy isn't working, because the constituent we that has been imposed upon us from above is just not accommodating enough. It is dehumanizing, it is coercive, it is exclusive, and people are now reacting to that in a myriad of different ways by rejecting that idea, right? And along with it, democracy. So we need to build democracy from the ground up, and we need to do it by creating an equitable and inclusive we. Right? We need to build an equitable and inclusive we that begins in the private sphere, right? Begins at home. It has to address issues of gender, and it has to address issues of race, and it has to acknowledge the fact that we live in a highly globalized world. All of the things that we have been attempting to deny. And so, as long as we have people like Rachel out there doing that work, I think there's a great deal of promise and, great deal to hope for. So remember that the Women's March is not just an event, it's an organization. You can join.
Just like our democracy.
Although it's also an event on October 2nd in a couple of weeks. And let me tell you that we've already got hundreds of marches. And so we are going to see democracy in practice very shortly.
Ooh, how can people find out more, Rachel?
Womensmarch.com.
Womensmarch.com. Thank you all so much. It's been wonderful to have you. See you again soon. We love you, Rachel. Thank you for joining us. So sorry for your loss this week. Scott, as always, we'll see you again soon. Thanks for being a partner in this work.